Welcome back. In the last video segment, we looked at what it meant to do justice. Today, we're going to be looking at biblical principles for just living. What does living justly mean?
Living justly, at least as we try to explore it in this course, is about studying the heart of God, really looking deeply into the heart of God, as he's expressed that for us. He's given us a lot of insight into the things that are important to him in his word. So looking at the pictures, and more often in the biblical context, they're actually pictures and not so much definitions or propositional statements. Looking at the pictures and studying what is important to God, the heart of God, and then asking God the question, what have you given me? And what kind of person have you created me to be? That I have something unique or special to offer, to contribute for the things that are important to you, particularly for the people that are important to God. And I think for me, the helpful question always to be asking in terms of what it means to live justly is, what do I have to give that someone who God is going to bring into my life needs? That could be anything. It could be a statement. It could be some insight that I have. It could be something that I don't even realize, in a sense, that I have. But it's that heart of willingness to offer what God has given me to others, that God can direct and use to fulfill his purposes. Often that includes, and very often that includes, the material resources that I have. And the people God brings into my life who may need some kind of contribution or help in that sense may not be people who I even see face to face. The connections that God creates for us with people, even people who live in other parts of the world, can be quite surprising, but they can be quite serious, they can be quite real. And my ability to do something for those people and to connect with them through that, asking that question, may be a very important part of what it means for me and for anyone to live justly.
What did living justly look like in the Old Testament?
Many pictures in the Old Testament, many examples in the Old Testament. The example that I highlight in the course, because I think it's the most comprehensive one in some ways, is the picture of the social order of society, the life of the people of Israel, as God draws that out or brings that out in the year of Jubilee. A very special time of celebration, and also a time when there's some very serious obligations and responsibilities that are entailed. It's a time when the whole nation is given a year off, which is quite a striking concept. A year without work, a year without laboring, on the one hand. And for them to be willing to do that, for the people of Israel to be able to take a whole year off, means they have to trust God. They have to trust that God will provide. And as he says, as he promises, they have to trust that he'll provide generously. There's that element to it, the willingness to live in the expectation of God's generosity, not just we're going to survive somehow and get through, but that God actually provides generously, particularly for a whole nation. So there's that picture of the people of Israel living, resting for a year, and resting in God, and trusting in his generosity. But there are a lot of other obligations that go along that. Of course, the ability, the willingness of people to forgive debts, because in an ordinary society, some people get ahead and some people fall behind. The people who fall behind borrow. In this setting, the picture is that those who get into debt won't get into a kind of debt, a cycle of debt where the prospect of them ever getting out of that debt is hopeless. So you've got this sort of circuit breaker on the debt cycle where every 50 years there's this opportunity for people who've really struggled to be allowed to go back and start over again. The land that God had given to their family in the first place goes back to them, and they can start with a clean slate. And it also means that those who, in a sense, have given those loans and provided, in one sense, for those people, they also have to trust in God. Now, they've benefited from that. So there's an opportunity in this picture, in this setting, for people with initiative to go ahead to actually get ahead based on their initiative and the good circumstances of their life. Their hard work, maybe their sagacity, and the other things that give them an advantage. But up to a certain point. And then we go back, and everybody is given their traditional family land as granted by God in the first place. And they can start with a clean slate. It's actually much more complex than to tell in a short period of time. But it's a beautiful picture of a social order that allows personal freedom, that allows for initiative, but that also protects those who struggle from falling into despair and hopelessness. It sets an upper limit, but it also sets a bottom limit. And that's just one picture. There's also the picture of Cain and Abel, which is quite a dramatic picture in some ways. And itself, a real picture of justice from the standpoint of God. The ideal in that relationship were two brothers caring for each other, each with a different set of gifts and skills and even unique personality, who in the ideal world would have lived supportive of each other and, in a sense, contributing what each had that the other didn't have to the welfare of the other. What is the actual picture, the actual story? Well, of course, Cain, out of jealousy, kills Abel. And there's that wonderfully tragic moment where God asks Cain, "Where is your brother? And what have you done?" And Cain says, "Am I my brother's keeper?" And of course, the implied answer to that question, although it's never actually stated, is, well, yes. In fact, you are your brother's keeper. In a very profound sense, these two brothers had a great obligation and responsibility to each other. And in the absolute moral failure of the one to care for the other, in fact, he takes his life, we have that picture of sort of the opposite of what happens when justice isn't practiced or observed. We follow the path of our own heart's desires, and what it can lead to is the kind of person that will literally take the life of another person.
So does that mean, as Christians, we have to follow the example that's in the Old Testament?
The examples in the Old Testament, particularly the ones that I've given, or especially the one in Leviticus, is about a social order that was established for the people of Israel in their land, tied very much to the land, and in a sense under the direct sovereignty of God. Now, even by the time of Jesus, the people of Israel weren't living in that kind of context. They weren't living under the direct sovereignty of God, and they didn't even have reign or sovereignty over their own land. So a lot of the details of those social responsibilities and so forth had changed even by the time of Jesus, and they certainly don't apply to us today. What does apply, though, going back to the other picture, that picture of the relationship between Cain and Abel, are the moral values that were underneath those social obligations in that social order. That each of us has something that we can offer to others that they may need. And insofar as we're willing constantly to be asking the question, what do I have to offer to other people that will make their life richer? Then we're really living at the heart of what was behind all of those injunctions and examples in the Old Testament, and that still apply to us in our relationship, in our walk with God today. And the wonderful thing is, we also have to trust, like they did then, in the generous nature and the willingness of God to give and to provide generously. Just as much as they did then, we have to live with that expectation for this whole thing to work, because none of us has adequate resources to care for ourselves and for others based on our own abilities.
That's all well and good, but we live in a society that's very different from the one Jesus lived in when he was here on earth. So how do we as Christians live justly?
It's a challenge. It's a big challenge. I think, honestly, for us to look at the world that we live in and constantly be asking the questions, how do the choices that I make, how can the choices that I make foster justice? How can they encourage fairness, for example, in trading practices and so forth, so that other people in other parts of the world aren't indirectly exploited by the spending choices that we make in this part of the world or wherever we're at? Very, very complex question. And I think for us, any one of us to try to get our heads around the whole picture is, humanly speaking, probably beyond us. But we can come back to that central question of, if the things that I have ultimately really come from God, my opportunities, my background, as well as my material resources, then what is it God wants me to do with those things? Those were questions that were relevant, certainly in the context of the situation that Jesus was speaking to, when he used that image of the steward as a central image for our relationship with God. If we ask that question, if we come back to that question, one thing we can trust is that God will answer it for us. If we're sincere, he'll answer it. Now, we may not always like the answer that he gives us, and it may challenge us. But if we're willing to ask the question, he'll answer. And if we're willing to respond based on that answer, then he will also, one, take us deeper into our understanding of what's important to him, and two, show us the full extent of the resources that he's willing to and able to provide for us. And that includes experiences and insight and other things, not just material resources.